advice would you offer to authors about sharing stories of a diaspora?
I think it's really important to start collecting before you know what your project's going to be, to talk to people. My grandmother, she really enjoyed telling stories, but she would tell you the story she wanted to tell you. She wouldn't answer the question that you wanted to hear the answer to. But I think that's really important, actually, of any oral history project. You don't always get what you're asking for, but you should take what you're given and see what you can make of it. What's the story and the things that people want to talk about? Or what's the story and the things that really stick in people's mind? Because they are telling you something important, but you can't predetermine what that is.
Hello, I'm Gabriella Kelly-Davies. Welcome to Season 5 of Biographers in Conversation. In each episode, biographers chat about the multiplicity of choices they face while crafting life stories. I'd like to acknowledge Australia's first storytellers, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The Gadigal people are the traditional owners of the land from which I'm coming to you today. You'll find us wherever you listen to your podcasts and on our website, biographersinconversation.com. Let's start the show. In this episode of Biographers in Conversation, Australian Palestinian author and educator Micaela Sahhar chats with me about her choices while crafting Find Me at the Jaffa Gate, an encyclopedia of a Palestinian family. A portrait of Palestinian diaspora across 4 generations of Micaela's family. It pieces together fragments of memory, oral history, archival research, and poetic speculation. A kaleidoscopic mosaic, it blends biography, memoir, and social and cultural history. Fixing her gaze on moments, places, and objects from the streets of Bethlehem to the Palestinian neighbourhoods of New Jerusalem, Micaela writes about gaps, silences, and what dispossession steals that can't be named. Micaela, welcome to Biographers in Conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Gabriella. It's lovely to be here.
Congratulations for winning the Michael Crouch Award for a debut work. It's a richly deserved recognition for a story the judges said is expansive in vision, innovative in form, and profound in its contribution to contemporary life writing. Find Me at the Jaffa Gate is a work of rare achievement.
Oh, thank you.
You've described your book as a story that percolated for a long time. What was the catalyst for finally embarking on this project?
Yeah, thank you for that question. As a first book, I suppose, in a sense, one could say that they're composing or writing the book all their life. And so I feel like I've been collecting stories and anecdotes from my family for much of my life. But in a very specific sense, it was the death of my great aunt, Najla, in 2019 that created a sense of urgency for me about capturing the stories of what was left, of writing while things still felt like they were in living memory rather than things that had slipped over the horizon. In a funny way, a second death actually was another catalyst, and that relates to my life as a writer. I'd actually trained as a creative writer at university many years ago and stopped writing really for quite a long time for all kinds of complicated reasons, but in particular relating to the fact that I write primarily about Palestine, and 20 years or so ago there wasn't a great deal of appetite in the publishing world for that kind of work, I think. And during the coronavirus pandemic, and I live in Melbourne where we had very long lockdowns, I had a friend who would just drop piles of books on my doorstep. And one of them was a book by poet Anya Woolwich, who had died not long earlier. And I opened it up and discovered that it was dedicated to my honours supervisor. And I hadn't realised they were so close. And so I wrote to her and she asked if I was working on anything. And so that too was a catalyst to actually sitting down and putting something together, which, as it transpired, wasn't just a poem or an essay, but actually the manuscript of a book.
That's such a poignant reason to write a book, isn't it? I'm intrigued by the title of your book. Why did you choose it?
Yes, that's a good question too. In fact, the subtitle was the working title of the book. So during the process of writing, I called it an Encyclopaedia of a Palestinian Family. And in a sense, that title was very much the structure that helped me unlock the shape of the manuscript. And when I finished each section, I would call my father and he would call them entries, very much in the style of the encyclopedia. And I suppose to call it an encyclopedia was to think about what encyclopedias are and also the way in which the project of the encyclopedia was originally conceived. So, in a way, an encyclopedia through an Enlightenment tradition is telling us about what knowledge is worth recording and therefore what knowledge isn't, the knowledge that's left out. And I suppose the Palestinian narrative is a story that has been very much left out of curriculum and education and really public knowledge over the last 78 years. So, in that sense, it was a sort of counter encyclopedia or a space of counter knowledge. But I'm also reminded there was a lovely review that Rowan Carhill wrote of the book in the Journal of Intercultural Studies. And he writes about the sort of radical vision of the people who were originally involved in the encyclopedia project in the French Enlightenment. And so I suppose there's a connection there too that isn't just counter, but thinking about how you establish these compendiums of knowledge that fight against the contemporary grain or the grain of a mainstream cultural body of understanding.
How did this process of reading each entry to your father shape your book?
I suppose the COVID lockdowns here, I didn't live at the time particularly close to my father. In fact, he lives further away from me now than he did then. And he's not a great one for talking on the phone. And so having this project on foot and being able to read him the various entries or chapters was a way of having time together on the phone and being in touch without necessarily needing to hold a conversation. In fact, I'd probably written about 10 or 15,000 words before it became clear to me how I wanted to structure the book, or in fact, before it became clear that what I was writing was a book. And when I realised I had probably written about 10 or 11 chapters, and so I called Dad and started talking to him about them. And I went back and read a slightly earlier chapter to him, one that I hadn't, something I'd been working on. And he was incredibly moved by it. And it's a chapter called Wedding, 1932, about the marriage of his parents. And it was an arranged marriage. And I talk in that chapter about a story that I don't tell in the book, actually. And the not telling of that story actually brought my father to tears.
Mm.
And so, in a way, this process of reading to him these entries or chapters as I wrote them were really interesting mirrors of ethics, what I could say, what stories were mine to tell, and what stories were not mine to tell. And in a way, a fragmentary structure accommodates what stories are not yours to tell as much as they accommodate what stories are yours to tell. But also, it was sort of a process of discovery together. So I would read him chapters assembled from my memory or comprised of my travel experiences or my research on Palestine and Palestinian narrative. And Dad would sometimes come up with a range of other memories, some of which also made it into the book and some of which didn't. And sometimes he would challenge the stories I told because he had different memories of how things had happened. And some of those chapters sat with him for a long time or had an impact later on. I'm thinking of a chapter close to the middle of the book about the birth of my father. And it was actually the second time I read it to him that it had this really quite emotional effect on him, where he was moved to tears. And that's an interesting story because my family, when they left Jerusalem, where they were from, they left in response to a specific bombing, and we may talk about this later. And they needed to leave because my grandmother was about 10 days away from giving birth to my father, and all the hospitals in Jerusalem were full. And so they decided to go across to Amman, where there was space in hospitals. And There's a story that I tell in the book, but it was a story that I had never heard until I actually visited Amman and got stuck there. And I got stuck there because I'd lost my luggage. And so I had this sort of tourism time I never planned to have in Amman. And my aunt and my uncle both contacted me to let me know this story of the night of my father's birth. And I don't believe they'd actually thought to tell anyone until that moment when I was visiting Amman and was sort of visiting the memories of their own childhood that these stories were elicited or sort of recovered. So I think it was a process for both of us of learning the way that you learn from the different fragments of story that people give you. Not everyone is given the same stories, and so putting them together into this compendium was quite a profound process.
And I feel emotional talking to you about this. So it's got profound emotional depth for you and your whole family.
Mm.
You open Find Me at the Jaffa Gate with a prologue. In it, you describe your memory of sitting in a music lessons a few days after starting school. I'd love you to read an excerpt from this chapter.
It would be my pleasure. This is from the prologue. It's called Under Pigeons, a Melbourne prologue. For our last period, we sat in a circle on the floor in the portable music classroom, a room furnished with drums, triangles, a piano, and the ubiquitous Mercator projection on the wall. Our bent knees dripped with sweat in the late February heat. Mrs. Collins read our names off the roll, which she kept in an impressively official-looking folder, pausing over my surname, which she butchered as she rolled it around her mouth. Where, she asked, does a name like that come from? And, like my dad, earnest girl that I was, I took delight in this curiosity and replied with enthusiasm, Palestine. Mrs. Collins was visibly appalled. She swallowed hard and fixed me in a long stare, and I looked down at her swollen bluish feet in tooled tan leather sandals before she finished. I would think that is very unlikely. I was so pained to be called a liar in front of my peers, maligned by a teacher who seemed to know more about me than I did, that I ambushed my father from the back of the car that afternoon. Our name's from Palestine, right, Dad? I said, worried. And Dad looked at me in the rearview mirror of his dark brown Tirana and said, of course it is. And Mum said, why do you ask, Dal? And I told them about how Mrs. Collins had embarrassed me in front of the class. Mum reflected, I suppose you could say Middle Eastern if you wanted to be less confrontational. And Dad sighed through the windscreen at the idea that saying where you are from should ever be construed by a stranger as confrontational.
Thank you. Why did you choose this scene, and did you try other entry points into the story before settling on this one?
Yes, that's a good question, and one that I actually haven't answered before. In fact, the manuscript, which I was really working on and writing for about 5 years, had begun with what is now chapter 1, called Origin, and that was the starting point for me of the book. And it was only when I came to the process of finding a publisher or engaging in conversations with publishers that a friend advised me, or a friend and mentor advised me, that it might be wise to write a prologue of some sort, an introductory chapter. And the reason was because the book really insists on the reunification and reassembly of a vast array of family members in the book. So there are many, many characters within the text, and at least to me, it wasn't always particularly important for people to know precisely who they were, only that they were important, loved, missed family members. But I think this array of characters, combined with the fact that the way in which the story is told is neither chronological or linear, made it quite a difficult thing perhaps for a publisher to enter into. And so this friend had said to me, well, how do you reduce a particular experience in a new chapter that you might set at the front that both introduces readers to sort of the key characters of your family, but also that speaks to the experience of what it meant to be a Palestinian in Australia or in Melbourne in both the 1950s, which is when my family arrived, and then in the 1980s when I went to school. And I suppose school is one of those very important encounters in a young person's life, because you go from being in this sort of quiet, private, personal world, which is populated by family members who know you and you know them, and you understand one another's stories, as it were, to being in this sort of more public school space with people from different backgrounds, different influences, and of course a teaching staff. And this is where, I suppose, for the first time, I encountered what might be approximated to a mainstream view of what it was to be Palestinian. And so it seemed as quite a quintessential moment actually in my young life that was also a way of bringing readers into that experience.
Yes, readers always respond to the human story, especially when the human story is about the author.
Mm.
Many primary sources were destroyed in the 1948 Nakba. How did you research this story when the surviving sources are so fragmentary?
I'm quite lucky in a way, because my grandfather had the great presence of mind and he was a great documenter of things, but he did grab a vast array of papers to take with him in January 1948 when they left their home. So I have a sort of fairly unwieldy collection of papers and documents and photographs that my grandfather had saved, and also actually the collections of some of his relatives. He had a sister in particular who was also seemingly a great lover of photos, although I never met her. My pa was also very late in life prevailed upon to make a series of tapes. And so my aunt recorded several tapes of him talking about his life and his life experiences. And he was in his late 80s at the time those recordings were made. And the stories are quite circular, actually. They loop between present and past, and they veer between stories and digressions. And at some point, he says, because I'm too old to remember, I'll just come back and tell you the story when I do. And actually, I mention this in the text at some point when I'm quoting from his tapes. And I make the observation, actually, that because I'm too young to remember, I will do that too. So in a way, this storytelling style of my grandfather as a very old man, through this kind of looping narrative, looping geographies of the way that he was narrating his life at that point, became a methodology for the way in which I wrote the encyclopedia. There was a sense here of writing a collective narrative, of a polyphony. So there was sort of a collecting of stories between different family members, but also, I suppose, in another life, I'm a researcher and I have a doctorate which is really on the way in which narrative is circulated in the public sphere about things that happen in Palestine or to Palestinian people, that thinks about things like national myths and national narratives. And so I sort of had a framework or a scaffolding of historical knowledge to assist me. I suppose also there's been a real explosion in recent years in thinking about ephemeral archives. So in the absence of official archives or state archives or continuity in place, what is it that fragments can tell us, both the fragment themselves, but also the things that are missing? How do we read absence as well as how do we read the traces that we have in front of us? So all of these were ways into the story. Other important things, I suppose, were objects, thinking about sort of object memory and what can be gleaned from, in some ways, fairly inconsequential items that were saved by various family members during the Nakba and during, their process of dispossession and exile, and understanding that those things have a significance or a story to impart, or that they take you back to a time and a place, and perhaps also take you into the bigger meaning of things. I'm thinking here, of course, of some of the wisdoms of oral historians who think about what we can make of the past is in part what's conveyed through how people remember things, whether or not that's in fact the statistical or documented truth of that moment.
It really makes me think about the research that life writers do and how writing about invisible people and people who are forgotten requires a completely different way of researching. And it's all those things that you've just said. It's about researching into silence and invisibility. And it's quite fascinating to see how you assembled the research given all of the silences.
I mean, I think photographs are also a very interesting trace and relic. At some point during the process, my editor suggested to me, in fact, in an earlier draft of the book, from beginning to end, I'd had little epigraphs at the start of each chapter, and they were alphabetical, but sometimes they, of course, replicated a letter from the alphabet because there are 48 chapters. And she said to me, you know, some of these are really beautiful, almost like small poems or something, but some of them are quite strained and I don't think they're working, and I think they're disruptive, and, you know, they sort of interfere with people's entry into each chapter if you have them at the start of each chapter because they're quite short chapters. And I thought about it, and then I came back to her and I said, well, could we save a few, the ones that are the most resonant or poignant or important, and pair them with images, but I don't want them paired with images as captions. I want them paired with images as kind of two found objects that have a resonance between the two of them, but not necessarily one that is a direct captioning. And so I think there are two that have more direct captioning. They're still from the epigraphic sort of draft work, but most of them are meditations that have a more elliptical relationship to the photograph. And that too was quite an important part of the project. But even just sitting with photographs, I mean, there's two photographs in the book, Gabriella, that actually, one of them while I was working on the book and one when it was published, I saw new things. And these are photos that I've sat with for all of my life. So one of them quite late in the book is a studio portrait of my grandmother with her mother and her sister-in-law. And it's a very loved photograph in my family, and many people have that picture of my grandmother Ellen. But I noticed as I was preparing the photographs for scanning and, you know, insertion into the manuscript that my grandmother was wearing a wedding ring. And so this suddenly put a date on the photograph. It had always been quite vague what that date was. And I mentioned it to my aunt and she said, oh, you're right, I never noticed that. So just sitting for long periods of time with what on its face is a document that you've finished with, except in a way you haven't finished with it. The other photograph where a similar sort of revelation occurred, but it's not written into the book because I only noticed when the first copy was sent to me, is on the dedication page. And there's a picture there of my father as a very small boy in Amman. He'd be not more than 2. And he's standing in front of my grandfather's Chevrolet. And when I opened up to the dedication page, the printed book, I saw for the first time, and this really is one of my favourite photos, but I saw for the first time that you can see not only his shadow, but 2 other shadows. And I thought, oh, it's perhaps the only photograph I know of my grandparents in Amman who are coaxing him to stand for that portrait. But I'd never seen it before.
It's incredible how you can reinterpret and reinterpret and reinterpret photos and objects and their significance. Thanks to a grant, you spent time in Jerusalem in 2023. During your visit, you'd retraced the footsteps of your grandfather, father, and several family members. How did that physical experience contribute to the story?
Oh, monumentally. I mean, I think it's so important to be able to access the terrain that you're writing about. And of course, in the case of Palestine, that's such an uncertain and beleaguered path that you may not be able to. So it's not the only way to do it, but I think it was really important for me in finishing the book, in finishing the editing process of the book and actually in bringing some of the contemporary colour to the book. But one of the really important things, I suppose, about Jerusalem, at least in the context of this book and in my imagining of it, but also in my family's imagining of it, my elder aunt's imagining of Jerusalem, is how it's walked around, actually, as a lived city, not as a city for pilgrims. I mean, in a way, it's just an ordinary home city, and there are distances between homes and schools and shops and your local parish. And this is what's quite important, I think, in the book, is a description of place that captures something of an ordinary neighbourhood in the same way, actually, that the book captures Newport in Melbourne in the 1950s. In a way, there's a parallel there with its capturing of Jerusalem, that these are the sort of ordinary places in which people are trying to live their lives. But also, I mean, the book, of course, is not just telling an historic story about my family. It's also telling a contemporary story about the occupation of Palestine. And so thinking about things like, what are the distances between places and what are the distances that occupation creates between places, and how do Palestinian people navigate that? Again, I allude to it in the book on several occasions, this idea of, you know, the distance of things as the crow flies versus the distance of things under this strangulation, if you like, of how Palestinian life is able to occur in their ancestral lands. So I suppose revisiting those obstructions is quite an important part of the book, in describing those things with truth and honesty and veracity, but also simply the walking of terrain, the uphills and the downhills and the distances between places, and also the colour of things. After that particular visit, I remember rewriting the start of a chapter, which was a chapter where I am inviting the reader into one of my first encounters with Jerusalem. And having just been in the old city, I was thinking about how the fact that these young Arab boys are all yelling out, you know, cold water, cold water, cold water in Arabic, and just this vivid, evocative colour. I mean, every young boy of a particular age that I walked past, I kind of imagined it was my father, because I was walking between two times. In, you know, in a sense, I was walking in the present as well as in their shadows. It also was one of the reasons why I became very committed to maintaining often a sort of present tense for the past, because of this palimpsest of the two experiences, a familial past whose footsteps you're walking in, and also inherited present, however painful and difficult that might be to move around in.
So, as you've mentioned before, Find Me at the Jaffa Gate is structured as an encyclopedia with 48 standalone entries. Please tell us about this structure and why you chose it, or did it choose you?
Oh, I think it chose me as much as I chose it. I think there was a bit of a mutuality in how that form was arrived at. I'd started writing sort of a series of ideas not dissimilar to the earlier chapters of the book, although probably with a less articulated narrative in them. And at a certain point, as I moved between place geographically, and also as I moved between time, sort of from the present into recent past, such as the period in which my grandmother was still alive but an old lady, and then the more distant past when my father was a young child, I started to organise it into a set of headings, and it was that set of headings that I suddenly realised that this encyclopedic structure was going to serve me. I think also within Palestinian storytelling, I think it's quite common to see stories that are either triumphant returns of a kind, or subduedly triumphant returns, or traumatic narratives of exile. And what I really was interested in doing was creating a diasporic story, to say that the Palestinian diaspora as a diaspora is something worth writing about, something worth seeing and something worth acknowledging, but that those experiences are, by their nature, by the very nature of diaspora, they are fragmented. And so the structure of the short entries, the capacity to therefore move quite fluidly between place and between time, allowed me to weave in many of the family members who were well known to me by name, but not necessarily people I ever had the opportunity to travel to meet, before their passing. And really interestingly, about a year after the book was published, some cousins that I did not know of, but their grandfather was my grandmother's brother, found the book and wrote to me to tell me in reverse that what they'd found in there was the stories of people whose names were so very familiar to them, but of whom they didn't know a great deal. There was a sense that these shorter entries were a way to contain the really vast cast of characters that I was interested in bringing into the book without necessarily needing to know everything about them, which would have been quite a difficult thing to reconstruct given the moment at which I started writing, which was sort of at the moment of the passing of the last person of that generation.
How did you manage the tension between these self-contained chapters and the narrative arc of the entire story?
It was always very clear to me that the narrative arc of the story was the experience of the Palestinian Nakba, so to convey for a reader truly what that meant, not as something historic and in the past, although that's also true, it exists as an historical event, but as something that is ongoing. And although the first draft had been written before the current genocide in Gaza began, I think the structure and the fact that the premise was to convey the ongoing experience of the Palestinian people, both in Palestine and outside of Palestine, it meant it was possible to incorporate the references to, or the story of at least my interaction with a friend in Gaza in one of the chapters, because of the structure that had sort of been created. I also had a sense of working through place and time as one of sort of reassembly. And so the order of the book, it often surprises people to learn. But I wrote the book pretty much in the order that it appears. It wasn't a sort of mix and match situation where I was swapping things around to see where they would fit. There was one chapter I moved during the last editing process, but with the exception of that, everything was very much written in order. So in a sense, it's the layering, the building of narrative in the order that you need it in order to arrive at the end with the specific catastrophic event that spells the exodus of my family, but of many other families from Jerusalem, and then the return to the house, and then the revelation that all of the book is the construction of Nakba. It's not just a single chapter or description of one particular event. It's everything in the book that takes you through what this has meant to the Palestinian people and what it continues to mean to the Palestinian people.
As you've mentioned, the book includes a polyphony of voices. How did you balance your voice as the narrator with those of your grandparents, parents, family members, and other members of the Palestinian diaspora?
That was something that I was constantly working with actually during the editing process, and speaking to some early readers, they felt that there were just far too many people, I suppose, in the book, far too many characters, too many names, at which point I made the decision to strip out the names of people from a particular tier or from a particular generation, because the stories that I was telling incidentally involved them but didn't necessarily rely on their identity for people to understand the story. And so at various points I'll say things like my cousin, which is quite a flattening way of describing people, and there's a number of different cousins described in the book. And actually one cousin, he was reading a section and he said, "Was that me? Am I that cousin?" So there were decisions like that where I thought I don't need to identify people necessarily because of the complexity of that. I think there are still mixed views about the decision I ultimately did make. I decided that I would put in a partial family tree that gave people a bit of a structure of my father's generation, my grandparents' generation, and then their parents. And I positioned it at the end of the book. And I did that quite intentionally. And I suppose it speaks to me not only as a writer, but as a reader, which is that as a reader, I have a very high tolerance for not knowing absolutely what's going on, because I'm more interested, I think, in the relationality of what's on the page rather than needing to know the actual mechanics of things. And I was hesitant to put in a family tree. I think it has helped people a lot. I know some people have wanted or wished that they had known about it earlier on, or that I'd put it at the start. But I intentionally didn't put it at the start because I felt it would over-determine how people were trying to read the book as a kind of mapping. And actually the mapping is the work of the book, not of the skeleton tree at the back. So those were some of the decisions that were made. I mean, my grandfather has a very strong voice in the book, I think, because of his tapes. And so my grandfather died when I was quite young, but because he made those tapes, and because actually one of my aunts wrote down quite a lot of his stories, there's quite a strong sense of his voice coming up to the present. My grandmother declined to make tapes at the time that my grandfather did, and she was interesting. She really enjoyed telling stories, but she would tell you the story she wanted to tell you. She wouldn't answer the question that you wanted to hear the answer to. And so I wanted to capture that voice, but actually there's a lot less written down with her voice in it, although she happily lived quite a bit longer than my grandfather. So I have adult memories of her rather than childhood memories of her. And then, of course, my father's voice, because Dad and I were speaking on the phone throughout the drafting process, was a very easy thing to weave in. And actually, in the notes and references at the end, there's quite a few little comments which reflect my dad's interactions with me about that reading process, not just the sort of narrative process of the writing of the book. So those were probably the three key voices in the text, certainly the ones that run through the most consistently alongside me. I think of myself as this sort of idiosyncratic narrator in that I'm required to hold everything together, but I must foreground my blind spots and I must foreground my speculations, because I understand the project as having or suffering from, and we were talking about it earlier, Gabriella, suffering from the sort of dearth of documents, the dearth of materials that one might have in constructing a different kind of familial history over 3 generations or 4 generations.
As you mentioned, in some chapters you had to speculate because you only had the wispiest of information available to you. To what extent did you place limits on your speculation to prevent veering into fiction?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I think nonfiction and fiction are perhaps more related than we imagine, although I fought very hard to keep this book as a nonfiction. One publisher did actually suggest to me that I ought to rewrite it as a book of fiction. There's a couple of chapters, I suppose, that really highlight that, and one of them is quite late in the book, and it's called The Seamstress of Jerusalem, and it's about my grandmother's sister who married very late in life and didn't have children, and in a way that was the in for me as a person who's not had children and found a partner relatively late in life, I suppose. And so it was actually that ancestral and familial parallelism that became a way to relate to what I knew of this particular aunt. I think also with her, I knew what she did. I had little tiny references that one particular aunt had notated on reading a book that reminded her of things, which is in itself quite a strange piece of documentation. And then it became a question of sort of stitching that together into a speculation on this person. And actually, in the case of that aunt, I think it was only possible again because my father and I made a trip to the States together in 2015, and it wasn't actually all that long after this particular aunt, Badia, had died, all of the cousins that I spent time with and met spoke about her various talents, of which she seems to have had many. She was a great cook, she was a great poet, she was a great family historian. And so in all these things, I sort of felt a very strong affinity, I think, but also like I was writing it through the things that I had gleaned from this vast network of cousins who had spent a lot of time with her in their lives.
In a chapter titled The Way to the Bomb Shelter, you write about your experiences of spending time in Jerusalem. Please introduce us to this chapter and read its closing passages.
Sure. This Way to the Bomb Shelter is quite a central chapter for me in the book. I know when different people read it and they have different imaginations of what is really central, what's the turning point or what's the linchpin. But the first time that I went to Jerusalem, I wanted to visit the house, and I was there with a member of a sort of activist body who did read Hebrew, and we got to the house and there was some, what I believe to be graffiti on the fence. I pointed it out to him and he said, "Oh, that's not graffiti. It's a sign and it says this way to the bomb shelter." And so this became quite an important conceptual marker to the house that my grandfather built at 8 Asser Street in West Jerusalem, which at the time was understood as the New Jerusalem, that is the neighbourhoods outside of the old city, but today has been partitioned, as it were, into what is called West Jerusalem, which is where the Israeli Jewish Jerusalemite residents live and is now a very, very wealthy and desirable neighbourhood. So this is describing that first visit to the house. This is a skinny street without pavement, Asser Street. There are just some white lines drawn on the bitumen, and we sit behind one of them, opposite the house, and I breathe in the intoxicating smell of the flowers, which is stronger at night. And after some time, a single figure turns into the street and then into the gate at the place we are sitting, and I call out to him, "Hey, you live here?" And he does, and my translator says, "This is Micaela's house that her grandfather built." And the man says, "But how can that be? This house is only 80 or 100 years old." He tells me, does he say it in Hebrew? I cannot recall, that he grew up here, in the flat that I think my pa rented out, 5th flat in the complex, with a roof garden terrace. He offers to show us some pictures of him growing up in the house if we want to come back at a more usual time. But I do not accept this offer. I cannot bear the thought of his memories crowding out mine, so carefully comprised by my aunts and Abdullah. I pick from the fence swathes of bougainvillea, and back at the flat we position a branch in an unused coffee pot, and I dry out the rest and place it in boxes, one for Juju and one for my father, but Juju does not accept this gift when I give it to her. I am thinking about how it can be that a man who lives in a house his whole life has literally no idea of the length of an occupation or the existence of Palestinians. I recall the advertisements that boast Arab style when I am the truth of how they are just Palestinian. I learn later, one Nakba, that Nakba is simply not known of among young Israelis. Sometimes they have heard of the word and sometimes they haven't. And curriculum is surely the way to raise a whole people out of a history, their own, by the state that replaced them. This activist says that this way to the bomb shelter is not graffiti but a practical marker. Sometimes people are told to get into them when the IDF is shelling the West Bank or Gaza. I am reminded of a story in which the only injury to an Israeli citizen during one such shelling is to a Holocaust survivor who, forced to wear a gas mask, becomes deeply distressed before he trips over in it. This is a state that keeps people frightened of people like me, who might knock on your door and say, all this is mine and I'm here to reclaim it. When I think of that night, I hope I became that young man's ghost and that I haunt him when he turns up the street after midnight. When I tell Juju and Tony about the sign, they both nod their heads and they say, makes sense. And they tell me of a well down the back of the premises, which from a structural perspective would be a good place for a bomb shelter. So I have taken you as far as I have ever been at 8 Assis Street, but there is more to say about the house my pa built and where we lived in the city we come from. When I tell Evan, my cousin, he replies, we own that house in a way that no one can ever take away. It was made for us.
Thank you so much. What's the significance of these passages?
I suppose that particular encounter, but we can extrapolate this more broadly, that particular encounter was quite a stunning one for me because as a Palestinian person, you grow up with an understanding of what has happened to you and who has done it, and maybe with some sense of recognition for all the forces at play that meant that this injustice could occur. And so it's quite shocking and I think worth talking about that you can meet people who come from a kind of settler class or the class of the oppressors who are quite literally unaware of the oppression that they are part of or that is done in their name. And so I was quite surprised, I suppose, to discover this idea that any sort of conflict was so far in the past that it wasn't possible that people still living would have a connection to these places. This particular chapter, there are 2 visits that it's thinking about, although they're sort of condensed into one, because right at the end of the chapter, I talk about this interaction that I have with one of my cousins who lives elsewhere and him saying that we have a moral claim to this place or this place was built in a way that no one can ever take away. And actually, this was a much later lesson that I had on my 2023 visit to Palestine. And I think there's a bigger truth in that, in a way. And I think there's a bigger truth in that, the framework of settler colonial context, that there is an anxiety about ownership because people understand that something has gone wrong, whether they benefit from it or not.
In closing, what advice would you offer to authors about sharing stories of a diaspora?
I think it's really important to start collecting before you know what your project's going to be, to talk to people. If you have, voice recording technology or even something so simple as a dictaphone, it's worth using it. I wish I had and had done some of those things myself at an earlier time. And also saving the ephemera. I quite often worry about what people throw out thinking that it's of no value, when actually, to someone who's also trained as an historian, it's amazing what you can learn from a boat ticket or a railway ticket or a cinema ticket. All these things can be assembled into particular frames of understanding that can be really quite meaningful. So not dismissing the ephemera. I think another thing for diaspora stories is that, and I said it a little earlier in this conversation, Gabriella, when I was talking about my grandmother, and I said, she wouldn't answer questions that you asked. She'd tell you the stories she wanted to. But I think that's really important, actually, of any oral history project, is you don't always get what you're asking for, but you should take what you're given and see what you can make of it. What's the story and the things that people want to talk about? Or what's the story and the things that really stick in people's mind? Because they are telling you something important, but you can't predetermine what that is.
Mm.
I also think it's very important to do your research. So I really notice, particularly as people lose their memory, in older generations, and memory is such an elusive thing for us all, but it seems to get shakier in an 8th or 9th or 10th decade of a life. It's quite a fragile thing. Doing your research and having a very good understanding of the framework of the questions you want to ask, the historical things that have happened. It's amazing what prompting with a little bit of knowledge can do within the context of storytelling. I also think unconventional forms are worth exploring in diasporic stories. I don't think we write about diaspora often enough. And actually, an interesting thing that's come out of the book is the number of people from other diasporic backgrounds, not Palestinian ones, who have told me that how much the book has meant to them too. So I think there's an appetite out there for people who want to write about diaspora, but the work is not so linear, and I'm not sure what project deadline you can fit diaspora work into. There's not a clear beginning and end and linear way of following through the story.
And that's why there are so many experimental life stories being written at the moment, because we're writing so much more about invisible people and dispossessed people.
That's right. And I think it's a really important moment in non-fiction writing, in oral history, in life writing, because the impact of seeing yourself somewhere for people is just enormous. You know, I think now about the role models that I feel my students have that I did not necessarily have as a young person. And I'm pleased by the changes, and I think we have still a long way to go.
Micaela, thank you so much for chatting with us about Find Me at the Jaffa Gate. It reminds us that the very heart of biographical writing is an act of refusing to be silenced. In the case of people who've been dispossessed, life writing bears witness to what was taken, unnamed, and scattered across generations of diaspora. Find Me at the Jaffa Gate asks us whose life stories are worth sharing, and it answers with lyrical conviction that the life half buried in silence may be the one most urgently in need of a storyteller. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for listening to Biographers in Conversation. Special thanks to my producer Andy Marr, web manager Dylan Hamilton Foster, and Sunny Lauderdale for the music. We'd love you to take a moment to rate the show on the website, across social media, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your family and friends and on social media. To discover more about my guests and their biographies, head over to their show pages on biographersinconversation.com. There you'll find all our episodes and ways of getting in touch with us. I'm looking forward to our next conversation about the choices every biographer faces. I hope you are too.